requiring a minority offensive assistant in this fight?
Well, they've essentially created a new position in the corporate world. Folks would call it a fellowship. It's something that's being
Fellowship.
sponsored by some other entity, and in this instance, the National Football League, and not necessarily by the owners' investments themselves. So I wonder the efficacy of this strategy long term. I think that it's a great first step. I do question, particularly when you look at the history of affirmative action in this country and its efficacy, if whether or not expanding the minority category in this situation to include women will help or hurt folks like Brian Flores, who, of course, we know sued the NFL earlier this year. We know that this is an outgrowth of this, and they've made a dozen changes to the Rooney Rule over time, including just last fall when they ensured that now coaches would have to interview two minority candidates for head coaching roles and one for other positions. And so I question if it's enough to just check that interview box, or if it really is about long-term change in the NFL.
Yeah, Angela, this is, first of all, so glad to be with you. This has always been my stance. There are 30 white owners in the NFL that really run this league, along with Green Bay, who is a committee, and Shad Khan, who is the owner of the Jacksonville Jaguars, who is considered a minority, well, is a minority owner in this league. But when you look at the overall arching problem, and I understand that these are supposed to be fixes or coaxes to what the issue is. It really boils down to those men, those women that are in ownership positions in the NFL to fix this. The onus should be upon them. That is what I have been saying for years. The league, we always say the league, the diversity and inclusion. And obviously, if you're a body and you're a representative of the NFL, you want to try to enact these things to create change and make this a more diverse and inclusive culture and give opportunities. But ultimately, what is at the heartstring of these owners? Do they really want to see diversity and inclusion in the NFL? It will always come back to that. I understand it. And I kind of operate off this mechanism, Angela, and you can speak to this after I make this statement. I've always believed that in order to change something where people have ownership, give an example. The owners own the mountain. The mountain is the place with all of the resources. Only the owner of the mountain can change how business is done. So I continually want to hear from 30 owners, 30 white owners. I want to hear from the ownership in Green Bay and Shad Khan from the Jacksonville Jaguars and tell me how they want to change this. As opposed to us always putting Roger Goodell out there or some other committee or some other person to try to identify and rectify the issues that are going on with the NFL. These owners know just as well as you and I, Angela, what the damn problem is in the NFL. And they have to be the ones to change it and fix it. I get it. We have to enact things. We have to create the Rooney Rule because it's already a problem. You facilitate where you got to interview minority. That guarantees nothing. I want these owners to come out and guarantee something about diversity and inclusion. The president at ESPN, Jimmy Pitaro, does. He makes statements about diversity and inclusion within this organization. The heads of ESPN, they make statements about diversity and inclusion because they can actually change it, and they have done a good job at changing it. I want the owners to say something.
Yeah, and I think the issue in this particular situation you talked about, for example, the owner of the Jacksonville Jaguars and wanting him to say something. Well, he has. He hasn't necessarily said it at the NFL, but he was the primary investor for the Black News channel that
Black
just
news,
refused to
yep.
pay all of its employees after filing bankruptcy. So you have people that say things in other ways. Sometimes it's through hot mics, and sometimes it's through something as egregious as that. And so the reality of it is interviewing is exactly what we say it is. It's interviewing. It is consideration. And in some instances, again, according to Brian Flores' lawsuit, it's not even real consideration. So if it is a method to check the box And so long as Roger Goodell, who you just brought up, is content with offering up changes to rules but not enforcing those rules, we'll continually have this same conversation. If there is no accountability attached to the rules that are laid out and they can have meeting after meeting and revision after revision, if after recruiting they interview and it stops there, they don't worry about the hiring, they don't worry about the retention, and they're not worried about penalizing folks who don't meet the standards and who are not accountable to diversity off the field. They care about diversity as long
Right.
as it's making the money on the field. But when we get off the field, what will we do? When we get into some of those offices, the business offices, and into some of the strategic decision-making power that owners, GMs, and other executives have, even the coaching staff, we're going to continue to have this same conversation. And so I'm with you that we need to see changes from the owners, but if there is no penalty from the league, the owners will continue to do what the owners do.
Guys, let me just jump in here really quickly and ask a couple follow-up questions from layman's term here. So, Angela, I want to ask you this. When we're talking about essentially a fellowship, creating a new role, this offensive assistant coach, is this even a step forward? And how would you have liked to see this role handled?
One, I think it is time for us to separate out kind of the historic, systemic racism, oppression, and discrimination that each respective protective class has experienced. So I would not group, one, I hate the term minority, just as an aside, but I would not group women and people of color in the same category. They have a responsibility to women, particularly the women who watch the NFL, and they also have a responsibility to the players to ensure there are coaching staff and executives who look like them. And those are two separate issues. And I think that they can make intentional strides to ensure that people of color and women are represented. But by virtue of this particular rule, I'm actually disheartened by it, because I think they're saying, all right, we just got to hire one of them. And I think that's not okay, particularly because, as I said, it's more like a fellowship position. It's an on-ramp because they're not really seeing the qualification of women and people of color to be ready and primed to fulfill these roles already. It's like, we're going to give you this kind of assistant role to see if you can ever measure up to the standards of the white coaches we're used to hiring.
Marcus, let me change subjects to you, because there's a few things I want to get to. We only have so much time here. But you mentioned ownership, and I'm looking at this right here. It says they publicized a mission statement to encourage and attract diverse members of prospective ownership groups. The statement read in part, the membership will regard it as a positive and meaningful factor if the group includes diverse individuals who have a significant equity stake and involvement with the club, including serving as the controlling owner of the club. The statement does not require minority participation in ownership groups. Marcus, what does this even mean? And is it accomplishing anything? And it says the first test case will be the Denver Broncos and how they handle their sale.
Yeah, Molly, I've always contended that the Rooney Rule within itself, the fact that it need to be implemented, and we know we're not naive as black people, that you have to have legislation and rules enacted in order to create a semblance of equality and give people opportunities to move forward in whatever that construct is or whatever that system is. And Angela made a point about this fellowship potentially, but I see that differently. And we would have a discussion about that, because in the coaching ranks, offensive guys, offensive assistants, offensive people in that role from a football standpoint are the ones that's being promoted. Now, this will put the NFL on onus. If you get minority coaches, black coaches, women in these positions, and they do a phenomenal job, and the success, like we've been talking about, that the Kansas City Chiefs had, for example, with Eric Bieniemy, the success of his role and how that is immediately impacted on the field, and you don't see coaching hires, then I'm with Angela. We revisit that conversation. But that opportunity is something that I believe needs to be implemented, because it puts black and minority coaches, women, in a role in which the hires are actually coming from. If we look at this last cycle, it's offensive coaches being hired at crazy numbers as opposed to defensive coaches. The other part of this, Molly, is with the committees and the groups and the things that are being put together. We all know you need ownership. How many times have we said representation and a seat at the table? Right? When you have, and that is actually, and why I've enjoyed listening to Angela Rye for so long, that is actually the utopia. That is where you want to be in order to have the best product that you can have. And I get it that this is not the cycle of thinking from owners in the NFL. They're used to doing business one way. It's a good old boys club. They all get together in sunny Florida and they talk about how much money they're making and how well the league is doing. They implement some changes to some rules. They have diversity and inclusion conversations and committees. But ultimately, if you don't have anyone in that room to not only give a different perspective, but to enact things on their own to give minorities an opportunity, to say this is not a fair playing field. This wasn't a fair playing field before I entered myself into this ownership group or this pact that's been created. That is where significant change happens. I go back to when Jay-Z was hired on, and it was a mixed reaction from the black community. It's like, Jay-Z tying his hands, he making money. The other part was, need a seat at the table. Somebody has to be there representing what the issues are, what the things that we're talking about to try to make this better. So hopefully, Molly, and that's what we deal with. Hopefully that between these owners, they get together and say, hey, we do need an African-American owner in the NFL because it's going to make us better. It's going to make our product better. It's going to open our eyes. And that's why I always try to tailor this conversation to going back to the ownership group. And you made a great point. They have say in who owns teams when they come up for sale. That's another issue that has to be talked about.
Angela, I want to give you the final word here, and you can go wherever you want. But what I was going to get to, so now they have this diversity committee. What should be their top priority to actually elicit real change?
I think it's about metrics of success. If there are not benchmarks put in place to ensure that owners are accountable to the league and there are penalties assigned when they fall short, I think that we're going to be right back here at square one. So the reality is the ownership conversation is a billionaire conversation. Most of us can't afford a seat at that table. How do you ensure parity there in a business, right? When you're talking about hires, how do you ensure that you're creating an environment where the team and the coaches feel like it's a safe place to be and stay, and they're being measured by the same wins and losses as the white coaches? The diversity committee needs to be considering those items, and hopefully they're not just happy to be there. We don't need any more people who are just happy to be